I'm Alec Russell. I'm the editor of the Weekend FT. For those of you that don't know the Weekend FT, it's the fun part of the FT. We deal with life, culture. We also deal with ideas and issues, and that's where this session comes in. We have a mighty panel. All of my four panelists have had, dare I say it, kaleidoscopic careers. I'm going to introduce them. I'm just going to mention the specific roles with relevance to this session, because otherwise I'll be talking for quite a long time. John Emerson, on the right, was until January the US ambassador in Berlin. His 4 years covered a pretty weighty time in US-German relations, but also pretty weighty time for Germany vis-a-vis the European Union. Here on my immediate right, I have David Landsman, who was the British ambassador in Greece. And that, of course, was at a time when Greece was facing an existential threat vis-a-vis its membership of the Eurozone. On my left is Peter Mandelson. He has held a whole host of prominent roles vis-a-vis Europe. Most strikingly, he was the EU Trade Commissioner, so he probably knows more about the likelihood of Britain being able to negotiate a trade deal and the difficulties ahead than anyone in LA at the moment and beyond. He also, to a certain extent, embodies the title of this session, in as much as his once mighty political party, the Labour Party, for which he held three cabinet posts? 3 cabinet posts, 3+ cabinet posts, when it was just dominating the British electoral scene, British political scene just a few years ago. Well, the Labour Party is now in some difficulties.
And will no doubt come back again.
We'll come back again, but maybe not in 4 weeks' time at the British elections.
Ah.
And then on my left, the far left, we have Alec Stubb, who was the Foreign Minister of Finland, the Prime Minister of Finland. But the reason I'm most happy to have you here on the panel, Alex, is you're, I think, the only person I know who has written for 2 separate parts of the Weekend FT. You've written for the comment pages. You've also written for the travel pages about being an Iron Man in Hawaii. It's a pretty compelling moment to be addressing this session. Many of you will no doubt be tempting to exhale now. You'll have seen that Monsieur Macron seems pretty well set to win the next election. You'll be thinking, hooray, Davosian man is back. Isn't this fantastic? Well, just digest 2 pieces of data and then let's kick off. Number 1, Marine Le Pen's party is now the biggest party in Hauts-de-France, which is a sort of mighty industrial region in the north, and also in Provence. Digest that. Point 2, the extreme left and the extreme right parties in France won in the first round of the election just a week ago over 40% of the vote. So maybe a little early to start celebrating. Right, I'm going to start with you, Alex. You've been in the room in some of these big European meetings in recent years. Undeniably, in the last few years, populism has been rampant across many countries of the European Union. Is this a cyclical issue or is this structural?
I think it's probably both. To be honest, I think populism usually emerges when you have a few things on the table, and I'd say 5. Number 1 is an income gap, whereas a perceived notion that someone else's income is growing and yours is going down. The best one I've heard was in a panel in the UK when a British politician before Brexit said, what's the point of voting ourselves out of the EU when our GDP is growing? Someone from the audience shouted, yeah, perhaps your GDP, mate, but not mine. So the income gap issue is 1. Sudden asylum or immigration movements is number 2. Perceived notion of corruption is number 3. A financial crisis is number 4. And the 5th one you need is a demagogue to incite these. So when you have these 5 ingredients, you end up getting populism. Someone can say it's structural. Someone can say it's cyclical. I would say it's real. We've seen it, obviously, with Brexit. We've seen it with Trump. We've seen it with Le Pen. We've seen it with Geert Wilders. We've seen it with Farage. So it's something that cannot be taken lightly, and it's something that we have to live with it.
Peter, come in here as a very prominent centre-left politician of the last few decades. I want to just cite Wales which is an improbable part of the world to be focusing on here in LA. But Wales, for those of you that don't know, was traditionally the heartland of the British Labour Party. Well, we ran an article about it this weekend in which we said that the Tories were likely to get a greater share of the vote in the coming UK election in 5 weeks' time than Labour. Well, Peter, you wrote recently that we did not grasp, the Labour Party, did not grasp the disenchantment pushing voters from the mainstream. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, when I said we, I didn't just mean the centre-left or the Labour Party. I meant we in mainstream politics, centre-left and centre-right, because in effect it's the entirety of the mainstream that has been put on trial by the public. And I don't think that is surprising, partly for some of the reasons that Alex alluded to. But what we are seeing are the aftershocks of the global financial crisis. We've had getting on now for a decade of lost growth, widening income inequality. In Europe, we have gone through not just the financial crisis, the banking crisis, we've been through a sovereign debt crisis, we've been through ensuing recession, we've been experiencing austerity in government spending, which in the main has been applied unequally to different parts of society. And at the same time, we have seen in Europe vast quantities of refugees, suddenly, to all intents and purposes, emerging from nowhere and creating a disturbing picture for many in Europe. And we've had a whole series of terror events as well in different European countries. So it's not surprising that the public are out of sorts. And I don't think this is just a matter of economics, although that is absolutely central. I think that mainstream politicians have been flat-footed in coming to grips with identity issues, which have been very important drivers in the creation of the political sentiment and the boost for populists that we've seen across Europe.
Just one more on this point, though, specifically vis-à-vis Britain. It is, of course, though, the centre-left which is in more trouble than the centre-right.
It's kind of you just to mention Wales. We are also, I'm afraid, have been pushed into third place in Scotland as well.
Yeah.
Scotland used to be, our adult. I mean, Scotland and Labour were synonymous. They were interchangeable. We are also, in the current opinion polls, behind the Conservative Party in Scotland. We have one seat held in Scotland, and then we may well say goodbye to that at the coming general election. So I'm not, I'm not belittling what is an existential challenge, a crisis for the Labour Party. I would just say about it that whilst we in the Labour Party, rather like the centre-right as well, did not interpret correctly or respond in the way that we needed to the strength of public feeling following the global financial crisis, and that could trigger actually not just cyclical but structural turning of public opinion. But we have put ourselves in the Labour Party in a position with two successive leaders now who simply were not just unable to cope or manage, but actually took the Labour Party in the wrong direction. The current leader is essentially a left populist, and he thinks that the way back to power is to sort of spout a sort of pseudo-Marxism, a sort of anti-Western class war sort of rhetorical program. And not surprisingly, it does appeal to some, but certainly not enough to put the Labour Party in government, which is probably for most people's minds just as well.
John, I want to bring you in here. Traditionally, or certainly in 5 years plus ago, when talking about populist forces and the rise of the right, the one country that seemed pretty immune to that phenomenon, for some obvious historical reasons, was of course Germany. But in the last few years, we've seen this striking rise of a far-right party, far and away the most successful, I think I'm right in saying, since the Second World War. How worried should we be?
I think not extremely worried, because I think because of the history, there's a natural speed break in Germany to the rise of a far-right nationalistic party. And we're even beginning to see that at the height of the immigration crisis, the refugee crisis. Terrorism begins to come into German soil. AfD, sort of Alternative for Deutschland, sort of bumped its head around 15% in the national polls. They're now down to about 9%. The leaders of the party tend to have a successive series of problems of thinking it's funny to dress up as Hitler or make references to that period of time, and that tends to hurt them. And what the polling found in Germany was that much of AfD's support was less anti-Euro and more of a protest vote against the Chancellor's immigration policies back in 2015 and the early part of 2016. So they will be in the Bundestag for the first time, I think, since the end of the Second World War. You'll have a far-right party. There have been other far-right parties, but they have not made it to the Bundestag. They're likely to hit the 5% threshold in September. But I'd just like to make two other observations. I agree with everything that's been said about...
oh dear, we'll have to change that then.
No. I just want to add two things. In addition, kind of Alice's prescription, what we've also seen is a complete distrust of established institutions.
Yeah, that's a corruption.
I mean, people in Europe tend to think, well, it's more like a political corruption. They tend to view Brussels the same way people in the heartland here view Washington, D.C. And also the media, with all due respect. I mean, that has been a problem. And the other piece we should not ignore is the role that social media, and in particular Russia's great success with their propaganda and their trolls and their sort of trying to create problems or havoc through that media has had in encouraging this kind of disruption. So I just wanted to throw those two in.
I take your point that the AfD is not looking quite so strong now as it was even a few months ago, because there's a big sort of battle going on with it amongst its senior leaders. But nonetheless, the fact remains that a sort of taboo has been broken, hasn't it, really?
No question about it. And you could argue that the purpose of CSU, the Bavarian sister party of Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats, one of their jobs was to always stay enough to the right of the mainstream center-right party to prevent that kind of thing from happening, and it has happened. So, I mean, I don't diminish the fact that AfD will be in the Bundestag, and that's a significant issue, but I really do believe there's this natural speed break, and it's very hard to see it getting above the low teens in terms of its support.
Well, I was telling David earlier that I was back in his former adopted homeland, Greece, just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm now a sort of instant expert on Greek politics. Greece, of course, was the great home of populist politics 2,500 years ago, and there were still these demonstrators going around the government square, sort of shouting at the government and so on. One of the things you were saying that struck me very forcefully was that, of course, we make a mistake in thinking of these movements as being just a matter of the sort of deindustrialized classes, that it's far bigger than that, this distrust. We're talking about the middle classes as well, aren't we?
I think this is really important, because if you look at the history of successful populist movements, it's when the middle class gets involved, when the middle class buys in, that tipping point usually happens. So I think we have to look very carefully, because there are honestly, we step back from this for a moment. I guess, it's not my job to call for a show of hands, but I guess we're all in favour of liberal democracy in one form or another. But what is, the liberal democracy is the establishment of the day, so it takes the responsibility for whatever goes wrong. Now, if your business model gets disrupted, and in the age of social media, it's very easy for a business model to get disrupted, it's no good for blaming the disruptors. It's no good blaming the consumers. you've got to look in the mirror. And it seems to me that we've got to look back a step. What's going on in our societies? It's not just globalization. It's not just automation. It's the whole group of phenomena together. It's no good telling people that they've got to suck it up and live with it. In a sense, that's true. We are not going to turn back any of these phenomena, but we've got to come up with some answers. And I think the we is quite interesting here, because we're all part of this. Liberal democracy is essential for capitalism. Capitalism is essential for liberal democracy. So all of us here, whether we have political roles, whether we run businesses, whether we invest in businesses, we've all got to look, in a sense, at how we are going to find a future role in society for the middle classes. And I think, when we talk about middle classes, I know it means different things in the US and in Europe, but I think you've got the terribly exciting, terribly successful, terribly creative middle classes, and you've got the boring middle classes, not a word I would want to use, but the boring middle classes, the people who work hard in those jobs that are about to be automated, who want to look after themselves, who don't want to live on handouts, who want to be part of the establishment but see the establishment rejecting them, or at least not contributing to their progress. We've got to look as stakeholders in this, whether political or business, at what we can do to address this, because this is not just a political phenomenon. I think it's a much broader phenomenon.
Okay, well, I think much of that will sound quite familiar to US ears. Peter, looking for answers. So you're Emmanuel Macron, and you've won in a week's time. What do you do?
Well, first of all, I recognize that the reason I've won in France is because of what I'm not, rather than what I am. I'm not part of, outwardly, part of the old mainstream parties. I consciously left my own party. I stepped away from the sort of conventional mainstream centre-left, centre-right arrangement, which has become so discredited in France. And the other thing that I'm not is an ultra-right-wing nationalist. And that's basically why I have won, and what I have to offer is quite unproven. It has yet to emerge. And for Macron, the biggest challenge he's going to face, assuming that he is elected in a week's time, is not this election, but the subsequent elections for the French National Assembly. And if he fails to get any sort of majority in the Assembly, then he's going to find government very testing, and he's going to find it difficult to unify France around the reforms, political, economic, institutional, labour market, and many other reforms that France needs to undertake. Because one thing that is absolutely clear about France at the moment is just how polarized it is. And for him to bridge these and overcome this polarization, he is going to need a majority in the National Assembly, and it being France, he's also going to need a majority on the streets.
And presumably he won't be having a celebratory party in La Rotonde with his advisors, as he did last week, which Marine Le Pen seized on with enthusiasm.
No, I mean, he was
out of touch.
A bit embarrassing, a bit difficult, but that's not going, I don't think, going to sort of change the sort of the fundamental dynamic of this election, which, as I say, puts him ahead because of what he isn't rather than what he is. The only thing I'd say about Macron is that if he finds it difficult to run his own country because he doesn't have a majority in the Assembly and may face cohabitation with other parties forming the government, he may therefore have more time to devote to Europe's future. And I think that what he's got to do is not only save Europe from Madame Le Pen, which he would have done if he's elected, he's also got to be instrumental in saving the European Union from itself.
Yeah.
He's got to be a driving force behind those economic and institutional reforms that the European Union needs to undertake if it's going to recover its legitimacy and its popularity amongst its citizens.
I want to come back to you in a moment, but first, Alex, I did want to ask you actually about Macron's vision of Europe, which is very striking. But I think you want to say something first about Macron.
Sure. I mean, linked to that, really. I mean, the first observation that we have to make that Macron is not a foregone conclusion yet. So, you know, a lot of pollsters got it wrong on Brexit. A lot of pollsters got it wrong on Trump. So, you know, don't count your chickens yet.
Yeah.
And usually, you know, right now we're sitting at 60-40. Which sounds good for us liberal internationalists, but usually when you have one of these very black and white issues, a referendum of sorts, it usually goes closer to the 50 mark. So I think the gap at the end of the day is actually going to be smaller. And as we can see, any kind of a scandal, terrorist attack or whatever can still take place within the coming weeks. The second observation is, I agree with Peter, but I would frame it the other way around. What Macron is, interestingly enough, is very, not anti-French, but different from traditional French politics. Look, he's free market. You could almost say he's a little bit Anglophile. He's extremely pro-European. He's free trade. And he's taking almost not an anti-nationalistic approach, but an approach that we have not seen in France, you know, not since before the times of de Gaulle. And that's what makes him fascinating and interesting. And on top of that, he's very young. 39 in French politics, that's a spring chicken, you know. And in that sense, it's going to be tough. The final point I want to make on this, on the policies, and here's where I definitely jump on Peter's bandwagon, and Alec, try to answer your question. I think from a European perspective, the most interesting thing is, if Macron is elected, can he forge a Franco-German alliance? Because that's what we've been missing, I would argue, ever since Mitterrand and Kohl. If these two can get together, and I think they actually can, you know, they are pragmatic pro-Europeans. And I shouldn't probably say this, but there is an element of an older stateswoman and a younger male. And if these two hit it, you know, France and Germany are going to find themselves again. And that will, I think, drive European integration forward.
I was actually going to make that point, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think that in fact, she is looking for a partner.
Yeah.
I mean, she lost, you know, Cameron, as an example, you know,
I thought you were going to say she lost me, but that's okay.
Yeah, well, that goes without saying. But you know,
Finland, a superpower. You know,
I think that's a great point, and I think that, and even if, you know, let's not presuppose the German elections either. Even if Martin Schulz ends up becoming the chancellor, he too, I think, would be able to build that kind of relationship.
I mean, arguably, Schulz may be better in this arrangement than Merkel. I think Merkel, you know, for whom I have the greatest admiration, she is slightly dated, slightly jaded. I think she's somewhat risk averse. I think she has had bad luck in finding first Sarkozy and then Hollande as two difficult people to partner in creating that Franco-German motor, which is so important to take Europe forward. The only thing I'd say about Schulz is that, you know, he is fresh. He has a very strong personality. For better or worse, I think he's somewhat less risk averse. And I think he has a force of personality that Europe needs in this situation, in the leadership that France and Germany between them could offer.
Just one thing I want to raise here, the issue of the Franco-German motor, which, as Peter says, has been at the heart of the whole European project in all its decades. One of the issues that has come to the fore in recent years that people don't like to discuss that much because it's quite sensitive is that, yes, there are all sorts of sweeping economic forces that have contributed to the rise of the populists and so on and so forth. But there are quite a few politicians, policymakers, and ordinary punters in European countries, particularly smaller European countries, but also France, who think that a big part of the problem has been Germany and the German fiscal straitjacket that they feel has been put upon them and was put upon François Hollande's government, the outgoing president. So, former ambassador to Berlin, do Germans recognize this at all? Do German government officials acknowledge this at all? Can people talk about it?
Well, they certainly recognize it because in virtually every bilateral meeting between the president and the chancellor, and every meeting between Treasury Secretary Jackie Lew and Wolfgang Schäuble, and every meeting I was in, we raised this issue, particularly during the Greek financial crisis. And I would say that there's several dynamics to that. Number one, and obviously what we're encouraging them to do is invest more, particularly in the southern tier, and invest more in Europe overall. The thing that struck me was the absolute almost religious devotion to this concept of the schwarze Null, the black zero, a balanced budget, even from the leaders of the Social Democratic Party. And this obviously is a hangover from the hyperinflation in the Weimar times and all that, but it's there, and maybe the sort of Schwaben housewife metaphor, but there's a real sense of, and I think candidly, I think some of the leaders of Germany, with all due respect to some of my friends who are sitting in the audience here, forget about the help that the EU and other nations gave to Germany to help with the integration of the GDR right after reunification, and to help with that process. But there's sort of a sense about, we reformed, we tightened our belts, we did it, you need to do that too. And I'm not sure that it works, and that's an issue we pushed. So they recognize it, but they don't agree with it, I guess would be the way I would put it.
Can I
Alex, and then David.
Yeah, John, I'm going to have to disagree with you on that. Actually, Alec did say, I'm a sad case. I was also the finance minister of Finland. And given that the word is going over to the former Greek ambassador right after this, I distinctly remember the summer of 2015 when we were on the brink of pushing Greece out of the euro. And the basic philosophy, and yeah, Finland is one of the hawks as well, belongs to the category of thinking that if you have rules, you need to abide by the rules, especially if you are in a common currency. So I think what the Germans did, what the Finns did, what the Dutch did, was to basically try to say that if our currency is credible, then we need to stick to the Stability and Growth Pact and everything that it entails. And the feeling is also, I mean, for all Americans in the audience, there's been a lot of talk about bailing in, bailing out. I mean, it's a similar situation. Why doesn't the United States bail out Costa Rica? Well, that's the thinking that we have in Europe as well. And we wanted to be tough on this. I think the Germans took the right line, and history, I think, has shown that at the end of the day, we have salvaged and we sorted the crisis. And after this, we have actually strengthened our financial institutions. We're moving towards a banking union. Was it a perfect solution? I don't know. But this is very much the sort of northern way of thinking, and I do admit that there is a division between north and south.
What will happen then, Alex, if Italy comes next?
Well, if it's an Italian banking crisis, then, and I can say this because I'm not finance minister anymore, then I think we might be in trouble.
And
because
then
those big, and then we go through the same rigmarole again. This is one of the institutional problems that we have with the European Union. If you have a common currency, if you have a common financial policy, you should probably move towards coordinating your economic and fiscal policies closer, but then you get so close to the core of national sovereignty that some, probably all, finance ministers get quite scared.
I want to return to a sort of move to increase centralization in a sec, but we've had a hawk, we've had an ambassador to a hawk. Now, David, come on, we need someone to represent the doves here. You're no longer ambassador.
No, and I was the British ambassador to Greece, not the Greek ambassador to Britain.
Indeed. Yeah, but ambassadors go native, don't they? Yeah?
Absolutely not. We've had some splendid, absolutely right kind of discussion about the big strategic issues, the Franco-German motor, the direction of Europe. You know, the wars are often fought on some rather remote little bit of territory somewhere, and we remember that point at which we thought that Greece might bring down the eurozone and goodness knows what else with it. And I think there's an issue here about perceptions, and they are very different. If you're a Greek, and you're a sensible Greek, you will recognise absolutely that Greece and Greek governments have made many, many mistakes over many, many years. That's not in doubt. You will probably believe, and possibly rightly, that the rest of the European Union and the Eurozone connived in many of those, perhaps connived even in Greece's joining the Eurozone. You will probably believe that the Eurozone, and perhaps particularly Germany, when it suited them, quite happy to sign off Greek progress and work with these Greek governments, even when you as a citizen could see that things weren't going well. And when it suited politically, the economics didn't much seem to matter. When it didn't suit politically, along comes the inspector with the spreadsheet and starts telling the Greek government that things are going badly. I remember a friend of mine who ran a retail business in Greece would be able to correlate his takings week by week with what the Greeks were hearing on the news. And what were the Greeks hearing on the news? One week, that the Eurozone is going to do this. This is good news. Next week, the Eurozone is going to do the opposite, bankruptcy. This is bad news. People stop paying. They didn't believe for a minute that it was objective and related to the economic situation in the country or the performance of the government. They thought the whole thing was a political game. And I think there's a lack of credibility there when the whole thing becomes, and perhaps this is a question, an inevitability when you have a kind of a currency union which is run fundamentally politically. They didn't believe that good behaviour was being rewarded one day and bad behaviour was being punished the next. They thought the whole thing was a game. And they saw conniving and they saw gaming the system on both sides. So I think there's a question for me, and perhaps it was because I was an ambassador in a kind of a peripheral country at the time, but the question kept coming back to me. We're actually quite good at thinking, we're quite good at thinking of grand strategy, but it's how that grand strategy plays out in each country, particularly perhaps in the peripheral ones. I was also in the Balkans, in the countries that want to join. Mm-hmm. How are these decisions seen, as it were, by real people on the ground? Are they seen as the manifestation of liberal democracy, or are they seen as part of a rather dirty political game? And I think, and it's easy perhaps here for us to take the more benign interpretation.
Peter, Macron talks of a much more centralised Eurozone, or pushing for that if he takes power. He's been arguing for a common finance minister, amongst other things. Is that the answer?
I think it's part of the answer. I think that the currency zone, the sort of core of the European Union, the real union itself, within Europe, definitely has to sort of complete the construction of the policy architecture and framework that was originally designed but not fully implemented in order to support Europe's currency. So I think he's right about that. The problem for him and for others, however, is that amongst the public in Europe, there is a rather large degree of integration fatigue. I mean, that sort of irreversible momentum towards further integration and ever closer unity, that momentum has stalled in Europe. And for those who are reformists, I mean, those who, as I said, rather provocatively want to save Europe or save the European Union from itself, have got to think in quite a sort of broad way about how the institutions of the European Union as a whole, of which the Eurozone is the core, will evolve in the future. I think it is very important that we have seen from the Juncker Commission a white paper that sets out a variety of different options and ways forward for the European Union. I think that thinking is refreshing. I don't see it as defensive. I see it as an important statement that Europe's leadership are prepared to come to terms with the fact that the status quo is not defensible. It's not one that we should align with. and that we've got to sort of remake our future in Europe, economically, politically, and institutionally, if we're going to continue to build Europe as I would like to see it, not just as a sort of bulwark for peace, and not just as a generator of prosperity, both in Europe and the rest of the world, but also as an emerging power block in the world that is capable of balancing that of the United States and China. That's the sort of Europe I want, a Europe of peace, as I say, a Europe of prosperity, but also a Europe of power and influence in the world. But how we do that is going to require some truth-telling amongst mainstream politicians in Europe. We've got to stop defending the status quo, as I said, and recognize that it is flawed and it needs to change. We've got to not be tempted into idealizing the past, as the populists on the right and the left tend to do. But we've also got to tell the truth about the future, which I believe the populists don't do either in the United States or in Europe. We've got to interpret, in a sense, the future and what is going to happen and what the impact on the economy and society is going to be of the fourth industrial revolution that is unfolding, what it means for work, for incomes, for employee rights and responsibilities, how people pay taxes now, whether they are individuals or businesses. And we've got to have a very serious truth-telling more than a session. And it's only, in my view, by mainstream politicians, the centre ground, in a sense, sort of fighting back by regrouping, listening to the public and what they're saying, regrouping, rethinking, generating new ideas and policies that address this century, not the last one, but then, of course, find the charismatic leadership in the mainstream of politics, again, that's going to be capable of selling those policies, of selling those ideas. That's the great gap that we have. Both our ideas and our leadership are lacking, both on the centre-left and the centre-right, but as you keep reminding me, particularly on the centre-left. Thank you, Alec.
So less European Commission, more Truth Commission. Alex, there's been a lot of talk over the years about reforming how the European Union is run.
Yeah.
You have seen it close up from your times in Brussels summits. You look at it from afar. So how does one do this? Well, what is the one thing you would do if you could wave that proverbial magic wand to actually fundamentally change the way the European Union is run, and as a result, how it is seen by these dissatisfied electorates?
Well, I think actually I would probably do two things. You see, one of the big problems with modern politics, which is always on the surface between national and international, so capital and Brussels, is that all capital or national politicians, what they do is they go into the blame game. They say basically that everything that's bad comes from Brussels, and everything that's good is thanks to me. And that's how a national politician does it. It can be a little bit the Washingtonian element here as well. And when you do enough of that bashing, that you don't give common institutions, common laws, roaming fees, these kinds of things, any credit for Brussels, you take it for yourself, then people are going to start blaming Brussels. And I think that's normal in politics. Nationally, you usually blame the national politicians, and the local politicians take with it. Now, the second one is, I agree with Peter. I'm actually, my background is in academia. I'm a real EU nerd. I've done my PhD on differentiated integration and the rest. I love this stuff. I've been involved in the Amsterdam negotiations.
You embody the problem for the
yeah, I'm the symbol. I'm the symbol, the bad guy in them. And there's so many people say, let's bring the union closer to its people and let's do this and that. I don't believe in that one bit. I think the EU at the end of the day is about two things. It's about values, which we should share and which are challenged right now, and then it's about results. But the problem with the EU is that it always advances in three phases, and this is where we come to the Truth Commission. Phase number one, crisis. Take Euro crisis or asylum. Phase number two, chaos, utter chaos, right? And phase number three, suboptimal solution. And you know, when we have that, crisis, chaos, and suboptimal solution, you're never going to get a highfalutin, wonderful founding fathers' vision of a grander Europe. So it is going to be more muddled through, and we just have to live with that. That would be my 2 cents worth. If I give another 2 cents, it would be to read the Commission's 5 different options paper. It gives a pretty good picture of what's going on in Europe right now, whether you want more Europe, less Europe, differentiated Europe, backtrack, single market, etc. So that's a good sort of snapshot.
Just bear in mind, though, also, Alec, just in case people run away with the wrong idea, the politics has not been got right in the European Union for all the reasons that Alex and others have explained. But the fundamentals of the economic union, its single market, the sheer scale of it, you know, 500 million plus consumers, now slightly smaller.
It's a bigger economy than the US.
Without Britain. Why is the US and why is China succeeding? Well, amongst other reasons, they have scale. And the single market, when working properly and fully and deeply, gives us scale as well. It's the common trade policy as well that we wouldn't have in Europe without the European Union, but also our antitrust, our collective competition policy as well. And those are the sort of the staples, the fundamentals, if you like. And what we've got to do is to underpin those absolute essentials for Europe's economic future by getting the politics more right than we've frankly succeeded over the last decade plus.
John, you've spent 4 years looking very closely at the European Union as something of an outsider. You've now turned to the US. Do you think the next decade or so ahead is just going to be more muddled through, or do you see any glimmers of hope that this mighty, great project can be revived?
I see a lot of glimmers of hope, but I'm an American, and
but you see it with outsider's eyes,
take that for what it's worth,
which is very helpful.
But I would say, number one, and I love Peter's thing about telling the truth. Of course, the challenge is in the era of social media siloization and accusations of fake news and all that, how we get that across. But fundamentally, what's interesting to me is that mainstream politicians are now talking about the issues that sort of led to this, if you will, kind of nationalistic revolt that we've seen in some of these countries, both from the right and from the left. So they're starting to talk about it. The Juncker, paper that we're just talking about as an example of leaders saying, okay, there is something wrong, and now we need to begin to address it. I mean, candidly, I think the combination of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump scared the hell out of a lot of people.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And there's a sort of a reaction to, oh my God, to that. I mean, I spent 2.5 months after the election until I got fired, basically trying to not just reassure Germans, but reassure them on the question of whether, you talked about values, it's the transatlantic values as well. Do the incendiary comments that came about in this campaign suggest that we no longer share the same values? I mean, that's a fundamental question, and I think the effect of that tends to be to bring people together as a way of reinforcing those values. So I see all of those as positive signs, and I do think that, notwithstanding the fact that both mainstream parties were sort of swept aside in the French elections and all that, I do get a sense that this populist wave is beginning to crest a little bit. Now, believe me, if we have another summer of 2017 or 2018 like the summer of 2015 in terms of refugees and immigrants coming into Europe, that'll come right back again. If we begin to have an uncontrolled wave of terrorist attacks in Europe, that can come back again. But even on that, what was interesting, I mean, my wife Kimberly and I were literally with the Chancellor when the attack occurred on, for sort of our, goodbye, discussion meeting, when the attack occurred at the Christmas market, and my security detail ended up being among the first responders. But the Frauke Petry, the leader who we now see as one of the more reasonable leaders of AfD, and the New Yorker did a big profile on her and everything else, she came out immediately and said, this is the Chancellor's responsibility. And the German public rejected that wholesale. In fact, the Chancellor's numbers went up after that attack. So even with the terrorists, you may even get a sort of a coming together dynamic that is almost counterintuitive. So I see in all of those things glimmers of hope. The right people are asking the right questions and at least struggling to find the solutions.
I want to just turn to Brexit very briefly, far and away the most consequential outcome of this populist surge. And I do also want to ask some questions, but first, David, you want to come in?
I just wonder whether there's a risk here, actually, in overplaying the threat. At one point in Greece, I think about 13%, if I remember rightly, of people were supporting the really fascist Golden Dawn party. Now, to my mind, that did not mean that there were around 13% of Greeks who were real fascists. They were supporting that party at that time because they were totally fed up with everyone else. They wanted to make a protest vote. I suspect the number of true believers was very small indeed. Now, if Peter will allow, I think it's probably the case that not everyone who voted for, and I'm kind of exaggerating, not everyone who voted for Brexit was a hard right populist. There just aren't that many of them in the UK. There's a risk that we really do overplay this as we take the campaigning rhetoric into our analysis and we say we've got a bigger problem than we actually have. There's a problem to the business model of the established politicians. There's not necessarily such a problem in terms of our countries turning against liberal democracy. And so it really is back to the, if your business model is threatened, don't blame the customer. Look at your business model.
Whatever the motivations of those who voted for Brexit, the clock is now ticking. So Theresa May has invoked Article 50. There's just under 2 years for Britain to arrange the terms of its divorce. Peter, you know this from both sides. You've been a British politician. You've been a commissioner in Brussels. Can you just talk us through the most likely scenario for the next 2 years?
Well, let me try and explain it through my own personal spectacles. I campaigned for Britain to remain in, so the result came as a big shock to me. And it is a binary result. I mean, you're either in or you're out, and by a relatively small margin, Britain voted to leave. And so leave we will, because that was the result of the referendum. But after I got over my initial shock, I just became a tad more sort of reassured or optimistic about what I thought would be the British government's approach during last summer. I thought that what the British government would seek to do would be essentially to reunify the country and to bring both sides in this very polarized debate together by leaving the European Union, but keeping 1 foot plus inside the European tent by remaining inside Europe's single market, which was an option open to Britain to leave the European Union, but to join the European Economic Area, as Norway had done in the 1990s when its public voted against membership of the European Union. And in that sense, we would be free of what people saw as the sort of political sort of apparatus of the EU, which many people disliked and rejected, but nonetheless keep that foothold in the single market so as to secure for our country that continuity of trade, which is so important, because half our exports end up being sold in the European single market. It's not some sort of incidental sort of, piece of a market in the sort of outer perimeter of our economic interests. I mean, this is our biggest export market by far in the world. And therefore I was very surprised and really very disappointed and now feel quite angry that instead of choosing that option, the government went on an alternative trajectory, which was not just to leave the European Union, but to leave Europe's single market, its customs union as well, in effect to bring about through that transitioning out of the European market, the biggest deliberalization of trade that we have seen anywhere in the world since the Second World War, and a very complex challenge it is going to be. But if that isn't enough, what the government then wants to do is, having taken Britain completely out of the EU and its single market in that act of deliberalization, it then wants to sort of negotiate its way back into the single market by re-liberalizing our trade by means of negotiating a free trade agreement as a third country completely outside the European Union.
And they can't do
all
that.
I can say to you is, as Trade Commissioner, having spent 4 and a bit years negotiating free trade agreements, this is not going to happen simply, quickly, or painlessly, and in my view, ultimately, not at all. Because what Britain says it cannot accept are the rules and the conditions and the, as it were, the architecture of the single market. It says we want to be trading in the single market, but we don't want to have anything to do with the European Court of Justice. Well, the European Court of Justice is the arbitrator. It's the sort of broker,
Yeah.
we know, where rules are in dispute, it passes judgment. We can't both be in the single market and reject that ultimate arbiter of the single market's rules. And there is a sort of fallacy, I'm afraid, on the part of many people, including many members of the British government, that if we somehow sort of write a big enough check, we can somehow, by means of a free trade agreement, just sort of negotiate our way back into the single market. No, no, it is not money for access, it is rules for access, and embracing, accepting, and operating the rules of that single market will be the only condition ultimately that determines whether Britain is fully in or fully out. And that's why now I have to say I'm a darn sight more worried about Britain's prospects than I was initially in the aftermath of the referendum. Because whilst neither Europe nor Britain is going to gain economically from Brexit, frankly, Britain has more to lose than the rest of Europe. And that's why I'm worried.
Alex, quickly, the view from not from Britain, but on Brexit, and then I want to turn to questions.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with Peter. I mean, Peter and Alec will know that I'm a complete Anglophile. I'm married to a Brit. My children have a dual nationality. I even love my mother-in-law and father-in-law in the UK. So, you know, one of the saddest days in my political life was definitely the vote on Brexit. And you see, the problem is that Article 50 was written in such a fashion that no one would ever be so crazy as to invoke it. And obviously the UK had to do it. And the problem for the UK side is that they have absolutely no negotiating leverage or negotiating cards. All you need to do, based on Article 50, is to give a date on exit, which is going to be the end of March 2019, and then you're going to have to foot the bill. In other words, to pay your commitments that you have agreed to. Everything else is basically detail, and on the detail, all the negotiating cards are in the hands of Brussels and the EU 27 member states. You will have seen leaked discussion memos from the 27 member states meeting this weekend. You will have seen Theresa May's reaction. Expect this for the next 2 years to come. At the same time, go back to perhaps what I was trying to say earlier, crisis, chaos, suboptimal solution. It's going to be nasty, it's going to be brutish, it's going to be short, but at the end of the day, a solution will be found. But for anyone to try to imagine that the UK will be better off after this, that is simple nonsense. This is a lose-lose proposition. The UK, unfortunately, I say this with a bleeding heart, will lose more than the European Union, but the European Union will lose a hell of a lot as well.
Alex, thank you. Somber view, clear, stark. Okay, a few questions. Really, questions, please, not statements. At the front here.
Is there a mechanism to save your...
Is there a microphone?
You mentioned earlier a need to save Europe from itself. Is there a mechanism, actually, for Europe to be reformed? There seems to be a mechanism for Europe to be destroyed by people leaving. But
First
what
of all,
would it take?
first of all, you need to make up your mind that you're going to do so, that it's too important to lose. Secondly, you need France and Germany to assume its responsibilities again and find a partnership between their presidents and chancellor and governments that enables them to do so. Thirdly, you need a core group of member states who will support France and Germany in exercising that leadership. And then you have to go forward with absolute grim determination to find a sensible a route out of the problems that Europe is experiencing. And they're not just economic, they're also political, they're institutional. I happen to believe that the solution to Europe's problems does not lie in more democracy. I don't accept there's a democracy deficit in the European Union. It's not a single federal state where you need more power being invested in a European government. We have member states who are the constituent parts. They exercise the democracy and the accountability to their national parliaments and to their electorates. But you do need strong institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Court, to make the whole thing operate in order to regain the legitimacy it needs. But above all, it needs to start delivering. And when it starts delivering, stronger economic performance, stronger place or influence being exercised by Europe in multilateral institutions and arrangements, stronger Europe presence in the international trade system. People have got to see the point of the European Union and know that it's delivering something for them that they wouldn't otherwise have.
So the answer is, it seems to me that there is sort of a mechanism, but it's going to be very, very hard to make it work. Let's have a question here, please.
Hi, it was quite refreshing to hear Peter Mandelson say that actually we need a truth commission, because obviously there's big challenges ahead, probably bigger than we've had, and we need big ideas that people can actually deliver on. I think my big question is, who is going to kind of get together? How are these ideas going to be formed? Because it seems like a lot of the organizations that potentially should be coming up with these ideas at the moment can't.
Yep.
Can I come back to the first question rather than something that was way outside my area? I think political institutions, structures, absolutely, I'm sure. But what we need are jobs for people. We need training for people for the new world that's coming. We need education to get into the 21st century. I work these days for the Tata Group, an Indian investor with a substantial number of employees in Europe. What we need to be doing is to be training people who can work in technology. We need jobs for people. Yeah. We need lives for people that are more than just receiving benefits. If we can do that, we've got to start for liberal democracy. Institutions, yes, but we can't just focus on institutions.
One more question. Sorry, behind you. Her hand was up moments before you.
Serena Rosso is my name. I have an organisation in Australia and in the UK, and one of the biggest concerns is that we do welfare to work. And in the UK right now, unemployment doesn't seem to be a big issue. They've completely changed the policies, etc. If Brexit is to continue, the fear is that unemployment will grow, particularly if France, free exits. What are your concerns about being ready for increased unemployment?
I think, Peter, you'll have to take that one. Is that all right?
Look, what Brexit... First of all, the vote in the referendum changed everything for us, but nothing has actually yet happened. And that's why people think, well, what's all the fuss about? The house hasn't collapsed, the roof hasn't caved in, it hasn't even kicked in yet. Second point is that there's not going to be some rapid disinvestment from Britain as a result of Brexit. The price we're going to pay is going to be in missed future opportunities, people deciding not to come to Britain or not to expand their production in Britain because they prefer to be in the single market of which we will not be a part. And so my concern about this is that what we are going to see is a steady incremental unfolding over the next 10 plus years in the economic consequences of Brexit rather than some rapid overnight catastrophe. And all that's going to be mixed in with the great disruption, dislocation in our economy, in people's jobs, in their livelihoods that we will be coming to terms with as a result not actually of globalization, but of the technological revolution that all of us are now taking on. Now, how is Britain going to be best placed or in a strong enough position to take advantage of the opportunities of that revolution, or are we in fact, as a result of what I think my main concern about Brexit over the 10 years is going to be a loss of talent, is going to be a brain drain from Britain as individuals, academics, companies just feel that Britain is a less welcoming place for them because it's stuck out there on its own rather than part of the bigger whole. These are the sort of real fundamental creeping dangers for Britain of Brexit, and they're dangers not just for us, because when our economy slows down and suffers, then that will have a negative impact on the rest of Europe as well.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, audience. I'd just like to thank the panelists, John, David, Peter, Alex. Thank you very much. Come back in 2 years' time and we'll have some clearer answers about Brexit.